Hi, class. I hope you all are having a good day today. I am here with you to talk about the writer Susan Minot and her short story Lust that was published in 1989. So I really love this story and I look forward to reading your thoughts on the discussion board. I chose this story because while it was published in 1989, I feel like the ideas that Minot presents about relationships between young men and women are still very relevant today. So in the story, right, we see that Minot explores the different ways that young women and men view sex. So the narrator, right, she's this unnamed teenage girl. We sort of estimate, I think, that she's probably around 16, 17, right? It appears that she's still in high school, right? And she writes about how, as a young woman, she feels pressure to put out, right? So to have sex with the young men that she goes out with. Okay. So even though the sex leaves her feeling empty, used, and like she's losing a part of herself, right? She continues to have these sexual relationships, right? She says things like, if you go out with them, you sort of have to do something. Right? And she also says, if you flirted, you had to be prepared to go through with it. And then also she says, the worst thing that anyone could call you was a cock teaser. Okay. Now, in contrast, the young men that she describes, right, they seem to grow stronger, right? They seem to be invigorated, triumphant after sex. She writes, the more girls a boy has, the better, right? He has more stories to tell, a fatter heart. Okay, so sex seems to build the boy's self-esteem while it appears to diminish hers. Right, so essentially what we see is this catch-22 situation, and that she feels shamed for refusing sex, and yet she feels empty and used when it's over. Okay. So I also like the way this story illustrates something important and very interesting, I think, about the young women's coming of age process. Okay, so there seems to be a time, right, in some, okay, I don't mean to generalize and suggest that this happens to all young women, right? But in some young women's development, right, we can see that there is a time when their focus shifts from their own desires, okay, so what we want, right, to our desirability. Okay, so what can we do to make ourselves desirable? Okay, so for example, right, the young woman that Minot is focusing on here, right, when she reflects back on her earlier childhood days, she points out that she's actually good at math and sports and painting, right, that she enjoys doing those things, right? She feels like she's good at those things. Okay, but she says, right, the moment a boy puts his arm around me, I forgot about wanting to do anything else. Okay, so we see then that her primary goal seems to become feeling wanted, right? Feeling as though she is the object of desire. Okay, so this becomes her focus, and her ambitions, right? Math, sports, art, those become less important than feeling desired by boys. Okay, and as a consequence, we see that she starts to lose touch with what she herself desires. Okay, and one of those things that, right, that we see is emotional intimacy. Okay, she wants that, but she doesn't get it. Okay, now I'll say a little bit more about the specific settings of the story in a minute, but I also feel like it's going to be useful for us to consider the story within the context of feminism. Okay, so and more specifically, right, what we today refer to as second wave feminism. So just in case you're not familiar with this, let me just give a little bit of background here. So when we talk about first wave feminism, we're referring to the end of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century, right? What were women fighting for then, right? Well, they were fighting for the right to vote, okay, and they were successful. Right, so the 19th Amendment was passed, right? That granted American women the right to vote. Okay, so that's the women's suffrage movement. Okay, then we have second wave feminism. So from say the 1960s to the 1980s, those 2 decades, right? What were women fighting for? What were they advocating for then? Well, one right, that women focused on then was control of their bodies, right? Control of their own sexuality. Okay, and so we know, right, in 1960, the FDA approved birth control pills, right, hormonal birth control, what is often called the pill, right? And this was very liberating, right, because it allowed women to have sex without the fear of pregnancy. And then, of course, in 1973, right, we had the Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade, right, which gave women the legal right to an abortion. Okay, so this change in the cultural climate, right, we see definitely a more accepting environment in which women could explore their sexuality, right? Women could have multiple sexual partners. Okay, so this like sexual revolution, sometimes people call it the free love movement. And we can see, right, that Minot's characters certainly benefit from these changes. Right? The young women that she describes, they're free, right, to have sex. They have easy access to birth control pills. So they are sexually free in ways that women of earlier generations were not. Okay, and I think this is a good thing, right? I think it's fair to say more freedom is good. Okay, yet I think so interesting about this story is the way that Minot shows us that actually some of the consequences of this sexual freedom on young women, right, like the psychological effects that we see feeling used, right, are not so good, right? So that there are actually some negative consequences, right, of this. Okay, let me share my screen now so that I can say a little bit about the writer. So here we go. Move me out of the way. Okay, so let me move me again. Right, okay. Put me over there. Okay, so there she is, Susan Minot. And, I kind of struggle with her last name, I have to say. For some reason, I always thought it was Minot. That's how I always said it. But then I was corrected, actually, that it's actually pronounced Minot. Okay, so Susan Minot, right? And you can see she was born in 1956. She is a novelist, short story writer, a poet, a playwright, a screenplay writer, and a painter. There are some pictures of her. So she was born in Boston, Massachusetts. Her father was a banker and a stockbroker. And there were 5 children in the family. Okay, so she was the oldest of the 5 children. And when she was 21 years old, her family suffered a terrible tragedy. So her mother was killed in a car accident right after an ice storm. Okay, so the mother was 48, again, 5 children. And so Susan, being the oldest, she really had to put some of her own, hopes and ambitions on hold because she had to help care for her younger siblings. She did go on and get an MFA degree, again, a Master of Fine Arts degree from Columbia in New York. I know that she was married twice and that she has 1 daughter. So these are some of her more well-known works I chose to put on the screen. So Monkeys, that is her first novel from 1986. Collection of short stories, Lust and Other Stories, right? That's the story where we're reading today, comes from that collection. Folly, 1994, Evening, 1998, and then a collection of poems from 2003, Poems 4 a.m. And I also, last thing I want to share about Susan Minot is that her novel Monkeys, right, was I guess like we could say wrote the screenplay based on monkeys, right, for a movie. And the movie is called Stealing Beauty, right? And it stars Liv Tyler, right? Daughter of Steven Tyler from the band Aerosmith, right? And you can go on YouTube and watch the trailer. I have to admit, I watched the trailer and I thought it looked kind of awful, in my opinion. But okay, let me stop sharing my screen. Now let's talk more about this story. Okay, so let's say a little bit more about the specific setting that we get here in the story. Okay, so what is the year, right? What is the time period that she seems to be writing about? Well, I kind of picture this as being the 1970s. Okay, now why do I say the 1970s? Well, there's some clues that are provided in the narrative. So she refers to specific songs that are very popular at the time. So Wild Horses, right? Steel Magnolia. Okay, so if you're familiar with the band, the Rolling Stones or the Grateful Dead, right? Those are their songs, and those songs were both published, one in 1970, one in 1971. Um, Also, we can say that we know that we are in a boarding school, right? All of the action pretty much takes place while this young woman is a student at this private boarding school in New England, right, called Casey Academy. Okay. Now, what's significant about that? Well, I think a lot, right? Because it gives us some insight about this character, right? We get the sense that she is upper class, right? Because there's mention of places that she would go on vacations, right? So, like ski resorts, summer houses where people have pools, right? I think even a mention of an island house. So it seems as though she is, from a family that has money. Okay. Now, also, right, this idea of being at a boarding school, right? What exactly is a boarding school? Well, it's the kind of school where your parents send you there and you live at the school. So you're living in a dorm, kind of like when you're in college, maybe, but this is for, high school. So it kind of makes us think, right? Number one, I'm kind of thinking, what kind of parents send their child to a boarding school? Okay, what does that suggest? I mean, it maybe suggests that the parents are busy, right? Maybe they have careers or they travel or who knows, right? But that they like send their child away. And maybe it's to get a good education, the quality of the education maybe they think is going to be better. But it just kind of shows maybe a little bit of a disconnect, right? That usually when we're young, we're living with our family, right? That's very important to our upbringing. And here we see this girl is not living with her family. Okay, so that's, one insight I think that we get. Okay. Now the point of view, okay, kind of unique in this story in that it is a first person, right? So we have this narrator, right? She's describing her experiences, right? But you might have noticed that in some places she uses you. Like she's describing something and then she talks about like you wonder how long you can keep it up, so saying things like that. And I think that makes it a little bit more like intimate as we're reading, right? It's a little bit more conversational. And it kind of makes us also put ourselves in this position. How would we feel if we were, experiencing the things that she does? I also feel like it's important to say a little bit something about the style, because this story I think is different than the other stories that we've read and that you probably noticed. It's very fragmented, right? Instead of, describing these big scenes, she's just giving us these very short little snippets, right? These vignettes almost of these different sexual experiences that she has. So it's kind of almost like an itemization of these different experiences, each with a different boy. Okay, so it's very disconnected. It's very fragmented. And I feel like, there's a reason why she wrote it that way, which is to kind of give us the feeling of being disconnected and fragmented, right? I feel like she's trying to highlight the isolation that many young women feel in their interpersonal relationships. So it's very quick moving in that sense, right? These very short paragraphs, she'll describe a boy and then go on to the next. Now it's interesting too, right, that as I said, she's not named. So I have to just call her the narrator, right? The unnamed narrator, right? It kind of makes us think, why do we not learn her name? None of these other characters ever refer to her by her name. So, but yet we get their names, right? So all of the boys, they have a name. And we don't have any physical description of this girl. We have no idea what she looks like, but yet we do know what the boys look like. Okay, so I feel like that's an interesting choice on her part, right? So these boys are listed in a very brief perfunctory matter. Okay. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this narrator, right? What qualities stand out in her, right? How would we describe her? And more importantly, does she seem over the course of the story to change, to grow in any way, to learn something about herself or about her environment? Okay, so let's start off with what do we know about this girl, right? Well, like I said, we get the sense that she's very young. I'm kind of in my mind thinking she's about 16 years old. That's my guess. Okay. Now, what stands out about her is that, as I had suggested earlier, she really wants to be desired by these boys. Okay, so all of her, earlier ambitions, she seems to kind of like I said, put on hold so that she can, feel desired by these boys, right? Because the worst thing that she can think of, she tells us, is to be, a cock teaser. So this pressure that she feels, right? And the way she describes herself, there's one line that every time I read the story, it really stands out to me. It's very brief, but she says, she describes herself as a body waiting on the rug. Okay, so she's describing this boy, right, who came in and took off his shirt, and then we slid onto the floor, and he got up again to close the door, then came back to me, a body waiting on the rug. So that's kind of what she's reduced to, this body that's waiting for him. Okay, and what is she waiting for him? For him to, engage in sex with her. Okay. Because we get other instances where we see the narrator is trying to connect to these boys, right? There's one instance where she's trying to engage in a conversation with one of the young men that she's with. She's asking, who are you? What are you thinking? Like, let's talk, let's get to know each other, right? And how does the boy respond? What the hell are you talking about? So this idea of her trying to have a connection, right? An emotional connection, not just a physical connection that she could have through the sex, right? An emotional connection. What are you thinking about? Let's talk. Let's get to know each other a little bit. And that she is just shut down. What the hell are you talking about? That's what the boy says. So she is really losing her own voice in this experience, right? Him saying, what the hell are you talking about? And just brushing her question off, right? Suggests that her voice doesn't matter to him. He doesn't want to talk. Right. And then other instances where we see her, the boy says, come here, he says. I go over to the hammock and he takes my wrist with 2 fingers. What? He kisses my palm, then directs my hand to his fly, right? His fly, like his crotch area, right? Okay, so, it basically, his intentions are very clear. That's what he wants. So we see this over and over throughout the story. And I feel like the way she describes herself, in my opinion, is very sad, right? And the metaphors I think that she uses are kind of uncomfortable for me as I'm reading the story. It makes me feel uncomfortable. It makes me feel a lot of empathy for this young woman. Okay, what are some of these metaphors that I'm referring to? Well, let me go ahead and share my screen because I think I have one pulled up here that I can just go to really quick. No, not that. I want this. Okay, so this is, I think, a passage that really stands out to me. So it's on the bottom of the page, right? The page 10. So she writes, the more girls a boy has, the better. Right? He has a bright look, having reaped fruits, blooming. He stalks around, sure-shouldered, and you have the feeling he's got more in him, a fatter heart, more stories to tell. For a girl, With each boy, it's as though a petal gets plucked each time. Okay, so let's just think about that metaphor for a moment, right? That description that for a girl, right? It's as though a petal gets plucked each time. So this image of a flower, right? Because she says petals, right? So if you picture a flower, it has a lot of beautiful petals on it. Once you start pulling the petals off, the flower is no longer as beautiful, as desirable, right? As a flower with all the petals. It's somehow less, right? It's kind of falling apart. Okay, in contrast to the boy, right, with a fatter heart, more stories to tell. Okay, and then the next paragraph, I feel like another of these metaphors, right? Then you start to get tired. You begin to feel diluted, like watered down stew. Okay, so this idea of stew, right? We don't want it watered down, right? It's less than, it's less desirable than. It's not the same. It's diminished. Okay, so the petals, the flower, the stew, right? She also describes herself as, quote, a piece of pounded veal. Right, and she describes herself also like a bathroom window that only lets a little light in. Okay, so I feel like this gives us a lot of insight into her emotional state and how she feels about herself. Now, I'd also like us to think about the role that her family and other adults play in her life. Okay, so as her family, right, I already said, what do we know about them? Well, we know that she was sent away to boarding school. Okay, so she's living away from her parents for a long time, right? And these are critical years, right? There's only one paragraph in the story where she refers to her parents, her family. And that is, she starts the paragraph, my parents had no idea. Parents never really know what's going on, especially when you're away at school most of the time. Okay. If she met them, my mother might say, Oliver seems nice, or I like that one without much of an opinion. Okay. If she didn't like them, he's a funny fellow, isn't he? Okay. My father was too shy to talk about them at all unless they played sports, and he'd ask them about that. Okay, so I feel like that gives us a lot of insight into the role that her family plays, which is not a very big role, right? There's really seems to be a lack of real communication, right? These very sort of cursory assessments that her mother would have of these boys. And then her father, right, doesn't even really have anything to say unless like he can connect with them regarding sports, something that he's interested in. Okay, so I think it's fair to say her parents don't really play a very impactful role in her understanding of relationships with boys. Okay, now there are other adults in her life that we get a little bit of information about in the context of the story. So I think the first adult that she mentions is actually the doctor, right? The doctor who, lives at the school or attends to the people in the school. And what do we learn about this doctor? Right. Well, it says the joke was that the school gave out the pill like aspirin. He didn't ask you anything. I was 15. Okay. So, and there's a little bit more about him holding up, an IUD, right? Demonstrating these various forms of birth control. But what stands out to me about that passage is that here she's 15 and that she is going to get the pill, but that the doctor doesn't ask her anything. Okay. Now I totally support girls having access to birth control, right? That I feel like is very important. So I support that. But yet, I also feel as though this doctor could have at least tried to have a conversation with her. She's only 15, right? He might have said something like, let's talk about this. You're going to start having sex. What does this mean? Just have a conversation. Let her know that this is important, something that, should be considered carefully. Okay, but nope, he just writes the prescription like it's nothing. Okay. Okay, now another adult in her life we learn about is the headmaster at the school. Okay, so what is a headmaster? It's kind of like the adult who's in charge of the school, sort of like a principal, right? Or a dean if you're at a college, right? So this headmaster, and so, how does he come up in the story? Well, at one point, we get a little blurb here where she is called in to talk to the headmaster, and she doesn't know why. So she goes in, and then we learn he had received complaints about my amorous displays on the town green. It was Willie that spring. The headmaster told me he didn't care what I did, but that Casey Academy had a reputation to uphold in the town. We've got 20 acres of woods on this campus. If you want to smooch with your boyfriend, there are 20 acres for you to do it out of the public eye. You read me? Okay, so this is this is what we get about the headmaster, which shows us that, as he says, I don't care what you do as long as you do not damage the reputation of the school. So that is his priority, right? He's complaining about her public displays of affection. So he's aware of the fact that she's, kissing boys, but yet he also, it's another missed opportunity for an adult to engage in a conversation with her, right? Why are you doing this? How is this making you feel? I know, right? He doesn't care about that. He only cares about the school's reputation. Okay, now the last adult that we learn about in the story is the house mother. And now, what is a house mother? I'm assuming it's this, a woman, an older woman who lives there with them at the boarding school, and that she is like a mother figure. She's the person that the girls can turn to with, problems or questions or concerns. Okay, so very, very important role. And so we get at the very end of the story this passage, and actually, you know what? I'm going to share my screen again so I can pull it up for us to look at. So let me scroll down to the end here, right? So right here, I'm at this paragraph right here, right? At boarding school, everyone gets depressed. We go in and see the house mother, Mrs. Gunther. She got married when she was 18. Mr. Gunther was her high school sweetheart, the only boyfriend she ever had. And you knew you wanted to marry him right off? We ask her. She smiles and says yes. They always want something from you, says Jill, complaining about her boyfriend. Yeah, says Giddy. You always feel like you have to deliver something. And what does she say? You do, says Mrs. Gunther. Babies. Okay, so this I feel like is very telling, right? Because we can see that Mrs. Gunther, right, is a woman of a different generation, right? She married her high school sweetheart, right? And that this pressure that she felt is to deliver babies, right? So she can't really relate or connect to these girls because she is a woman of a different generation. She doesn't understand them. Okay, so we see these three adult figures fail. I would say, right? They don't engage with the narrator. They don't have any meaningful conversations with her. Okay, now, right, while I have the screen open, right, sharing my screen, we're on the last page of the story, right, kind of returning to my question, is the narrator a dynamic character? Does she seem to learn anything, grow as a person? Okay. And I feel like the last, these last few paragraphs of the story, these are the longest paragraphs of the story, right? She's really kind of like thinking a little bit about herself, reflecting on her own feelings here. And I'm not going to read the whole, passage, but I feel like what we see is very uncomfortable, right? It's very painful to read, right? Because that paragraph where I have the little star, right? You can see that she's telling us how she feels after sex. Right? You curl up like a shrimp, something inside you ruined, slammed in a place that sickens at slamming, and slowly you fill up with an overwhelming sadness. Okay, so we see, right, how she feels. And then, the last two paragraphs of the story describe, right, her feeling really, it seems to me, detached from her own body, right, during sex. And then the very last paragraph, you do everything they want. Then comes after when they don't look at you. They scratch their balls, stare at the ceiling, or if they do, turn their gaze is altogether changed. They are surprised. They turn casually to look at you, distracted, and get a mild, distracted surprise. You're gone. Their blank look tells you that the girl they were fucking is not there anymore. You seem to have disappeared. So that's very, very painful, right? And it reveals a moment of truth. She tells us that she feels lonely, used, and tired, invisible, right? That she has disappeared. So what is this all about, right? I think Susan Minot is suggesting, and let me stop sharing again, right? She seems to be suggesting that this young woman, right, she has no problem like establishing a physical connection with these young men that come into her life, right? But yet what she cannot have is an emotional connection. So there's one point in the story where she says something like, you open your legs, but you can't dare open your heart. So she's having a difficult time finding a connection that is emotional, that satisfies her. That's what she really craves throughout the story. Okay. All she can seem to get, though, is the physical connection. And so that's what we see her engaging in again and again and again with these boys. Okay, so I feel like this is a brilliant story. And, even though it was published in 1989, it's sad to say so much of what she is writing about here resonates, right? And I wish we were in a real class on campus so we could, talk about it together, because often in my classes, I do have a lot of my students say that they relate, that they, that some of the girls will say, I have felt this way in relationships. I have felt that kind of pressure before. So I feel like this story is, very good at that. It's easy for us to connect to. Okay, so I am going to stop now. I hope you enjoy reading the story, and I look forward to reading your thoughts on the discussion board. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.